Hello, this is the Fate of the Arts podcast, episode 5. I'm Anthony Etherin, and my guest this time is Christian Bök. So, let's first of all talk about this 25-year project you just finished, called the Xenotext, or Xenotext if you insist.
Sure. Great pleasure to be here with you, Anthony. And thank you for bringing up the topic of this project that I've spent 25 years finishing. The book, the Xenotext Book 2, came out in June of 2025, a work that has taken more than 2.5 decades to complete. Part of the reason that the project has taken so long is that it's ambitious in its scope and requires an immense amount of resources to fulfill. About 25 years ago, I got the plan to, I think, build a poem written according to a very difficult constraint. I had hoped that I would be able to write a very short poem in the voice of Orpheus from the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, writing it in such a way that I could conceivably translate it into a sequence of genetic nucleotides. And then with the assistance of a laboratory, I would build this gene and subsequently implant it into the genome of a bacterium, effectively replacing part of its genetic code with my own poem, so that the organism would now become the living embodiment of this text. Now, lots of scientists and artists since the year 2000 have gone on, of course, to encipher information of all sorts into the genomes of organisms, doing so in such a way that you could then subsequently read those gene sequences and reconstitute that work, effectively recording it and then subsequently transcribing it later, even after the organism has reproduced itself and undergone many life cycles of growth. If I had only planned on doing such a task, I might have been able to complete it much sooner. But what makes my project different from these predecessors is that the organism in question can actually read the poem that I've implanted into it, mistaking this gene as a set of instructions for building in response a protein. Now, a protein consists of nothing but a long sequence of amino acids, just a string of molecules strung together, kind of like charms on a charm bracelet. And it just so happens that the string of amino acids in this subsequent protein encipher a totally different poem that also makes sense and speaks in the voice of Eurydice, responding to my poem directly in dialogue. So in effect, I've genetically engineered a bacterium so that it can become not only an archive for storing my poem, it becomes a machine for writing a poem in response. And there are, of course, a Herculean number of constraints required to actually make this project work effectively, so that the organism can actually harbor this genetic sequence in its genome and respond to it viably with the creation of this benign protein capable of folding and surviving within the organism long enough for it to be detected and readable. Now, the punchline for this crazy exercise is that the host for this project is a microorganism called Deinococcus radiodurans, a name that means quite literally the dire seed, immune to radiation. This organism is a very old bacterium. It's an archaic bacterium that has a unique superpower. It can repair its own DNA when its DNA gets damaged, doing so quickly enough that it doesn't tend to mutate or change or evolve. It can fix itself, the damage done to its DNA, so quickly that it doesn't change. Normally, organisms that cannot mutate or change go extinct because they cannot adapt to their environments. But this organism is already so well adapted to the utter lethality of the universe that it does not need to change. In this sense, it's a kind of evolutionary dead end. It's just so utterly suited to so diverse a variety of environments that it is generally immune to the effects of evolution. And it, of course, its capacity to repair its own DNA means that it constitutes a kind of durable archive for storing a poem. It can survive in all kinds of inhospitable environments. You can scorch it, freeze it, wither it, and it will not die. It can survive dosages of gamma radiation, nearly 1,000 times the dosage necessary to obliterate a human being. And it can thrive under these extreme conditions. Moreover, it can even survive in the open vacuum of outer space. We don't really know where this organism might have acquired all of these immunities, because there are no terrestrial environments that are so radically diverse that they would drive the evolution of this organism into these niches. So we really don't know what its natural habitat is. We can find it in the gneissic soils of Antarctica. We can find it in the fecal matter of elephants in Bangladesh. It was first discovered in tins of meat that were rotted after being subjected to dosages of radiation designed to actually sterilize these tins. So it's a very ubiquitous organism, probably, and may have perhaps spent at least part of its evolution off the planet Earth in an extraterrestrial environment before being returned to the Earth. It's a very extravagant speculation by some scientists, but its many immunities are a bit mysterious. And it's a very difficult organism to engineer. But by putting my poem into the genome of this particular bacterium, I would effectively be writing a book that could conceivably outlast terrestrial civilization and might exist on the planet Earth until the very last dawn when the sun explodes. So in effect, I've set out to literally write a book that could immortalize the love story of Orpheus and Eurydice for all time, literally lasting forever. And of course, it's taken 25 years to accomplish this task against great odds of failure. The chances of succeeding at this enterprise, as it turns out, are extremely unlikely on a cosmic scale. So there's some spookiness and uncanniness in the completion of the task, given that it's probably, at first glance, an impossible task. So I'm certainly relieved that it's over and I don't have to worry about having to do this kind of task anymore. It's been a heartbreaking experience to work for so long on such a difficult project without much votive support from the artistic community and the literary community. Receiving at least some support from the scientific community, from both financially and logistically, but the hostility, expressed towards this enterprise from the literary community has proven to be very demoralizing. But at least the work is out there now, and I would like to think that it makes an important contribution to the legacy of poetics in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's an amazing project, and it comes with two amazing books. Apart from completing that project, you've written plenty of poems around it. You're an excellent formal and constrained poet, as well as a science poetry dabbler.
Mm.
If you don't mind that phrase. I mean, you describe yourself as a conceptualist. I think people listening might not know that much about conceptual poetry, so could you explain that?
Well, if I have any cause to be remembered 100 years from now, I might be, in part because I helped to found the first avant-garde literary movement of the 21st century, a movement called conceptualism, a movement that attempted to respond to the affordances of the internet from the late 90s. Attempting to adapt poetry, I suppose, to the new means by which people could express themselves through this medium. Strangely, many creative writing classes, even now in 2025, are taught as though the internet does not exist. They are, presented, I think, in a manner which takes for granted the existence of these technological affordances. And for my gang of peers, we wanted to explore those particular aspects of poetry at the moment when writers and poets dismissed something as unpoetic, at the very moment when they would present a limit or a boundary beyond which something was no longer poetic, we got interested and wanted to know more about where these particular boundaries lay. And we perfected techniques that tried to render these kind of exceptional or anomalous conditions more tractable to poetry. And famously, my friend Kenneth Goldsmith perfected modes of plagiaristic appropriation, and brought those to a kind of acme of achievement as a side effect of the internet being one of the greatest copying machines of all time, and demonstrated the immense power of people to write by expropriating already written text and applying it to new contexts within these technological circumstances. Because of course, poets would, I think, tend to imagine that a plagiarized text can't possibly be poetic. And of course, we were attempting to show that plagiarism is merely one kind of tool that can be exploited by poets to interesting aesthetic effect. We also were very curious about Herculean constraints, very absurd degrees of formalism that could be exploited through the use of technological augmentation. We were very interested in those kinds of works that were regarded as functionally illegible, impossible to read. And we also were very interested in the likely machinic assistance in writing that appeared to be on the horizon, having computers do the writing tasks on our behalf, delegating much of our creative effort to machinic prostheses of the sort now, which are probably ubiquitous and habitual. You're just calling upon an AI to write on your behalf. We anticipated this 25 years ago and experimented with all kinds of machine-written poetry as a way of preparing, I suppose, people mentally and aesthetically for these outcomes. We were just very interested in what constituted the limit cases of writing. And in each one of these kinds of conditions, they all represent variations of uncreativity, to the plagiarized text, the constrained text, the unreadable text, the automated kind of text. All of these things represent limit cases, perhaps, for people's models of self-expression. And so all of the work that we've done, I think, attempts to respond to those circumstances sociologically in the modern moment. And for a while, for about 15, 20 years, we enjoyed an immense amount of prestige. Many of the books that we wrote became bestsellers. We got to tour the world and promote these activities. They helped transform at least portions of the culture around creative writing. And I would like to think actually granted people permissions to make things that would have otherwise seemed inconceivable. We wanted to expand the boundaries of what would constitute the conceivable in writing.
Yeah,
so that's kind of, in a nutshell, what conceptualism is. An experiment, a way of perhaps of responding to the affordances already given to us by conceptual art, and applying some of those prior lessons to writing itself, and really expanding upon them through the use of the affordances given to us by the internet.
Yeah, you gave permissions to make things that are not the acceptable face of poetry.
Sure.
And I've been thinking about this because, so 150 years ago, the acceptable face of poetry, the narrow definition of poetry, was based around meter and rhyme and all those things I like.
Mm-hmm.
Then modernism happened, which was a pushback against the idea that there is an acceptable face. Poetry can be anything.
Sure.
And then, but for the last 50 years or so, or a little longer, we have this lyrical free verse mode, which is the acceptable face of poetry, and also another narrow definition. So I'm wondering, how did this happen? How did modernism pushing back against the very notion of an acceptable face of poetry end up just creating a new one?
Well, I would suggest that the particular kinds of arguments that prevail among poets are recurrent. They're cyclical. There, I think, are typically two strands in the history of poetry that are often parallel with each other and perhaps even complementary to each other. Uh, in the Romantic era, it became, of course, increasingly fashionable to address the self, right? To think of a poem as a way of thinking aloud about the self in a kind of cognitive way, to reflect elegically upon past experience and bring it into the present in a manner which would be more demotic, I suppose, right? That would notice the poetry that already prevails in ordinary speech and attempt to pay attention closely to that. But at the same time, as you have a kind of egotistical sublime of the sort that William Wordsworth advocated, a model of poetry in which a person indulged in self-expression and did so in a state of emotion recollected in tranquility, right? You would have that model of self-expression. At the same time, and perhaps as a kind of bizarre contradiction, he also averred that these modes of self-expression, a poem was likewise a spontaneous outburst of feeling. And these two models of poetry are actually, I think, contradictory. You can't possibly, write a poem that is, on the one hand, emotion recollected in tranquility, while on the other, also write a poem that is a spontaneous outburst of feeling. The two models of poetry here are disparate from each other. But I think that they represent two separate aesthetics about how we understand self-expression. One is relatively conscious, and the other is relatively unconscious. One is, intentional, and the other is perhaps unintentional. One is contemplative and elegiac, and the other is more rhapsodic and euphoric, ecstatic. But they're both fundamentally models of self-expression. And we can see developments, an efflorescence of poetry that responds to one of these two models of self-expression. And I would say that these are the Wordsworthian forms of Romanticism. But you also have a different understanding of poetry that is coincident with that moment. You have a strand of Romanticism which regards poetry as not necessarily self-expressive, but constitutes an act of negative capability in which the ego is not presented front and center as a kind of egotistical sublime, but is actually suppressed so that forces other than the self can find means of their own expression without reference to the identity of the writer. And this would require a kind of negative capability in which the poet can become anybody, I suppose, right? They could conceivably take on the role of any person, not just themselves, or become the spokesperson, kind of oracular device through which other forces speak prophetically through the poet. And this model of negative capability, are not, predicated upon self-expression. They're really predicated on other values artistically. They're non-expressive, and they can be, intentional. You could imagine writing, for example, poetry that is written according to a set of rules that demonstrate your virtuosity and athleticism by consigning yourself to speak without talking about yourself, but trying to fulfill the demands that the language expects of you, or that this formal convention expects of you. Or you could even, of course, delegate the task of writing to forces outside yourself. You could roll the dice or pull, tokens out of a lottery basket. You could, write by trusting the aleatoric impulses of the universe itself, right? And we have lots of avant-garde examples of this kind of writing. But in both cases, they constitute elements of Romanticism. And I think poets, probably to a one, when they first begin, imagine that they are operating as romantics at heart, right? That we're all romantic poets at heart, right? I think that story sounds familiar to a lot of poets. But you still choose your weapons, right? You either, I think, decide to become a Wordsworthian kind of romantic poet, and that is probably what most people choose to do. They choose to do that. Or you become a Keatsian kind of poet, and by comparison, I think fewer people choose to do that. But the history of Wordsworthian forms of Romanticism, lead into the models of confessionalism, lyrical self-expression, the models of first thought, best thought, if you're speaking euphorically or rhapsodically, perhaps the automatic writing of surrealists, all of the models in which the self becomes front and center and is using poetry as a means of speaking on its own behalf. But the Keatsian models, the kinds of storytelling that we see, in response to Shakespeare, for example, in the poetics of somebody of that grandeur, lead, I think, into avenues of more avant-garde and experimental forms of writing in which the self is denied or suppressed, in which the poet becomes dispassionate and cool rather than warm, and is more concerned about the conceptual framework within which the poetry gets defined. So their poetry becomes the subject, if you like, of the work, right? It's self-reflexive. It's done for its own sake, without reference to anything beyond itself. There's a similar choice to be made for most artists, I think, in the visual arts. You either choose to be Picasso or you choose to be Duchamp, right? And they're both great. they're both excellent. But I think you can imagine that there's, I think, something in the Wordsworthian model that regards negative capability with suspicion. The egotistical sublime, I think, looks with much suspicion upon the negative capability and regards it as something.
This was my next question. Yeah. Why do you think that there's more hostility from the egotistical sublime poets towards the negative capability poets than there is the other way around?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a strand of the avant-garde and experimentalism that might greet lyric poets with a lot of unnecessary hostility. But when we look at the critical assessment, I think that the Wordsworthians are the official forms of verse culture, and if you, for example, believe that a poem, the poem's value arises from the quality of your authenticity or sincerity, right? Your capacity, right, to give voice to your most truthful sense of self. Every other kind of expression, all other forms of writing must be suspect. They must constitute forms of lying or superficiality. They must not deal directly with the seriousness of the actual self that testifies on its own behalf in the witness box in an effort to tell the truth. So in this respect, you're standing up for yourself when you write these poems, right? And every other kind of form of expression holds that set of values in abeyance, right? It does not stand and bear witness, right, to the experience of the self in the witness box, right? In fact, ignores all of that. And if you're somebody who believes that your story is important, that your personal experience is the yardstick against which value should be judged, I think alternatives are going to look especially destructive, right, to your enterprise. I mean, it's part of the reason I suspect that, in a milieu of identity politics, people look with suspicion upon writers who will not speak on their own behalf about their own identity or adopt the identities of others because of models of negative capability, pretending to be somebody else and attempting to speak authentically or sincerely from an alternative position, right, that testifies to the quality of your imagination and empathic attitudes. If you're not telling the truth, right, you must be evil, I think. And there's some valorization here of a truthfulness that it might be contrary to the artifice of art, right? The avant-garde, I think, presumes in advance that telling lies and speaking by holding the self in abeyance constitutes just a move, a set of gambits in art. Whereas, if you are on the side of authenticity and sincerity, all of those gambits look like hoaxes, right? They look like subterfuges or acts of deception, perhaps. So I think there's an ethical quandary for people who adopt.
Well, I mean, it's one of the clearest places that's happening is in acting. Because how do you act without pretending to be somebody else?
Well, that would be exactly my argument, is that the actor is an actor they're an artist because they're indulging in artifice. They're on stage. They're not, doing anything other than pretending to be somebody else. And it's not the quality of the sincerity or authenticity of that um, adoption of a character, right? Like you can't, you know, be sincere and authentic by pretending to be somebody else, right? Like the values are contradictory there. Like to me, it's ideologically or at least aesthetically incoherent. Now, sometimes you have to tell yourself a particular kind of lie in order to make a work of art happen, right? I mean, without telling yourself the lie that God exists, I don't think you build cathedrals, right? And you have to have. I mean, the world would be worse off without cathedrals, right? Really worse off. So respect the need perhaps to, adopt an attitude or a perspective and be sincerely engaged with it in order to make a certain kind of artistic gesture possible, right? To give you permission to do it. So in this respect, I can't fault it too badly that people, occupy this position. But what I think is deleterious to the arts is to imagine that that's the only one, right? To think that there are not these other alternatives that have their own rules by which they would judge their relative success. So if I'm reading a lyric poem, I probably give a lot of credence to somebody who actually pulls off the task of pretending to be who they are, right? Well, right, that they show this immense insight into themselves and make it available to everybody else. And they do so in a manner which universalizes that experience. I applaud that immensely. I think it's quite impressive when you can pull that off, right? But if you're judging, a poem that has been written by drawing lots out of a hat, right, you're going to be disappointed, right? Because those poems are doing something different. Their success is being measured by a different set of criteria, and there it's how spooky is the result, how uncanny, how lucky is the result, right? We're now talking about something that's more prophetic or oracular, right, in its models than something like how sincere are you, how authentically are you who you are, to what degree are you, indulging this mimetic representation of yourself adequately. And it seems to me unfair to judge these two things according to the same standard of value, right? That they're playing two different games. And as a consequence, the rules by which you determine a winner are different.
Yeah, it's tribal ultimately.
Well, there's the tyranny of subtle differences, right, among poets for sure. I mean, I've joked that many arguments among poets arise from Lilliputian disputes about what constitutes the proper scale for the minimal unit of writing. Like many arguments, I think, that actually arise from those presumptions. So if, for example, you believe that the smallest unit of writing, credible unit of writing, is a word, and that the job of the poet is to find the mot juste every time, you're going to be dismayed by somebody who believes that, in fact, the written mark, right, the unintelligible mark, is in fact the minimal unit of writing. And they use that to build visual poems, right, that don't make any sense and are not readable, can't be, pronounced aloud or anything. They only can be looked at. You're going to be disappointed. And yet, the only difference between those two acts of creativity is what constitutes the minimal unit of writing, right?
Mm.
If your idea of a poem is that the minimal unit must be the sentence, right? Then you're probably going to look at anybody for whom the minimal unit is a phrase with an immense amount of suspicion, right? And I think many aesthetic differences, like the schools of writing that you see, where there is, kind of tribal investment in a manifesto, right, with a series of claims being made about what constitutes the important path to pursue, boil down to a lot of, arguments about which end of the egg you're supposed to crack first when you eat it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mostly work with the minimal unit of the letter, but
Yeah.
I've used the word too in the sentence. I guess I'm just I'm just a very open, loving person who accepts
No.
anything.
Look, I don't think I don't a poet can of course write well in a diverse variety of games, but you can't play two games simultaneously. Like that's what I think is what
Mm.
I've learned, is that you can write a poem that is expressive and intentional, but you can't write at the same time a poem that's expressive and non-intentional. It's very like it's not probably possible. Like you can do the work of emotion recollected in tranquility, but it precludes you from writing at the same time a work that's the spontaneous outburst of feeling. Right? Those two things are not possible to do, I don't think, simultaneously, right? And because they're two different games, right? One is a pageantry of the self. It's a way of playing pretend. Whereas the other is something more delirious, right? It's like swinging on a swing or getting drunk, right? They're two different kinds of pleasure. They're different ways of understanding how you win, right?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. You can't work at two different scales within the same
That's
work of
right.
art.
That's right. Like I think the scale at which you work, you have to, it's like trying to look through the microscope at two different settings, and one's going to go out of focus, right? Immediately, if you
Mm.
try to look at them both simultaneously. So to me, there's something about the nature of the focus. It's not possible to be really, I think, expressive and non-expressive simultaneously. It's probably not possible to be intentional and non-intentional simultaneously, right? I think there's all kinds of inadvertent side effects. I mean, my gang of poets, were um, making claims, of course, that we were against expression. We did our utmost, right, to suppress ourselves and ensure that the self was not the you know preeminent part of what we did. But inevitably, right, stylistic idiosyncrasies
Yeah,
and
it finds a way.
differences, right, begin to assert themselves in such a way that you reveal who you are, right, in the work, right? I think, if I wrote an anagrammatic poem of the sort that you have written, right, using, the same degree of witchcraft that you deploy, it would nevertheless reveal something about me, even though I might not be writing about myself at all, right? It might reveal something about my bloody mindedness, perhaps, or my
Yeah.
obsessive
Well, this is
compulsive disorders, right? My insistences on certain kinds of aesthetic, formalities, all of which I think reveal, facets of my personality. If they don't do so very, robustly or richly, they nevertheless, showcase some interesting features of myself, right? Whether I
yeah.
like it or not, right?
This is exactly what I find. And I don't know if you heard, did you listen to the first episode of this new series?
No, not yet. Forgive me.
I forgive you. Uh,
Yeah.
but we had a conversation about AI, as I'm sure we will now.
Yeah.
Uh, you did listen to the episode I recorded with Sasha Stiles a few years ago on the
Yes,
last podcast?
I did. Yes.
In fact, I'll have to upload that again. And Sasha talked about how she collaborates with AI.
Yes.
And so no matter how much the AI is having its say, she's having her say, and her personality comes through.
Yes.
And I mentioned that when I work with a constraint, it's the same thing. I'm collaborating with the constraint.
Sure.
And so my personality will always come through. It's true no matter how strict the constraint is. I mean, sometimes it's my personality is hidden by just how difficult the rules are, but most of the time I see it coming through. And in the
Sure.
first episode of this series, I talked about how I was asked to judge a palindrome contest
Sure.
last year.
Hmm.
And because I know lots of people in the palindrome community, even though I was given the entry as blind, I was looking at them thinking, "Well, I know who wrote that. I know who wrote that."
Sure.
Because you can see the way people think and their sense of
Right.
humor, all these things. So it's fascinating. And so getting to AI, I think one of the reasons AI can't write palindromes, more importantly, why it can't write any good poetry, is because it doesn't really have a personality. And I think you're going to push back on that.
Yeah, I would say that the complaints about the capacities of machines to write poetry are occurring at the most embryonic moment of the machine's evolution. So it's tantamount to complaining about that a 4-year-old can't write a poem, right? Or that the 6-year-old is writing a silly rhyming poem, right? We're in the very embryonic moments of an emergent kind of intelligence, and nevertheless, I would say even in the most rudimentary piece of software that writes poetry, what I found quite extraordinary is that there are stylistic idiosyncrasies. Just as you've been able to detect, right, who the author of a particular palindrome must be, just from the diction or stylistic features of this constraint, which of course should really erase, right, pretty much any evidence of the mind behind it, right? Because of course it's a highly limiting factor on what you can conceivably say, right? But you were nevertheless attuned, right, to the subtleties of these formal dimensions that you could probably point to who the author is likely to be, right, for each of them. What I think is very interesting is that certain particular programs, particularly in the early development of machinic writing, actually have idiosyncrasies and stylistic quirks, making it possible for you to identify them by them. Now, certainly Racter was remarkable for this feature because it is really acephalic. It doesn't know what it's doing, of course, and yet it tends to write poetry better than human beings who don't know anything about poetry. I would say that if we can say something, to credit the machines for their creativity, it's that even though if we stipulate that they don't know what they're doing, they still do it better than human beings who don't know what they're doing. And in the case of Racter, you could immediately, I think, recognize its stylistic quirks. For whatever reason, it's fascinated with writing about steak and lettuce. It keeps coming back to particular kinds of themes or diction, and as a consequence, has its own idiosyncrasies. Like it has quirks or a style. And this got me to thinking at the time that really what we regard perhaps as our own idiosyncratic quirks of personality, our own styles, might in fact really be the most automated components of our creativity, right? That they may
Bugs.
constitute, right, these ruts or grooves, right, or habits that we are relatively unconscious of, that we don't tend to meditate upon and contemplate very thoroughly, and that they are simply the output, right, of the most automated features of our character, right? And we might be moving the goalposts every time the machines begin to encroach upon our capacity to write poetry, because they certainly do it better now than they did 30 or 40 years ago. They are, doing so in a manner which is increasingly credible, to the point where if a person does not know that a poem has been written by a machine, a blind audience might prefer that poem to one written by a person, right? That there's now some ambiguity, I suppose, or ambivalence, right, around who the author might be. It's becoming harder to determine whether or not the poem presented to you is the product of a machine or a human mind.
Mm.
And I don't foresee that that's going to get any easier to discriminate. We're not going to be able to figure out that in the future. I think it's just going to get worse. And every time the machine begins to encroach upon our aptitudes, we keep moving the goalposts, changing the means by which we gauge the merits of the machine's accomplishment, failing perhaps to appreciate that it's improving. And I have joked, right, that unlike the poets, the machines are only getting smarter, right? Poets, are maintaining their current level of stupidity. I think failing to recognize that they might be in a race up, Mount Parnassus,
Well,
and the
it's
machines are
not,
likely to sprint past us, right?
but it's not about intelligence so much as when we're talking about AI
Mhm.
poetry. It's not so much about intelligence as it is creativity and originality.
Mhm.
As you know, if you try to use AI to write palindromes,
Mhm.
it can't do it at all.
Mhm.
So I asked
I would
AI,
say let's check in tomorrow.
yeah, well, I asked AI why it can't do it. I said, why can't you
Yeah.
write palindromes? And it actually gave me a proper response.
Yeah, I saw the answer that the AI gave to you. It was a very self-reflexive, I think, honest assessment about its shortcomings, right? It was
Hmm.
pretty interesting that it was capable of understanding why it couldn't write a palindrome.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah, it
But
is amazing. It was amazing. Yeah.
it's the reason was well, one of the reasons was because it predicts the most likely next word and then searches
Sure.
through those. And of course, in a palindrome, you're not going to get the most likely next word. You're going to get something weird and
Yes.
something that's been something that's been worked on by a human, both intellectually and creatively. And
Sure.
that's what it lacks. It can do it. It can do the intellectual side. It can't think outside the box, to use a cliche. It can't. It can't invent.
We're moving the goalposts, right? Now we're saying, okay, it can't invent. And I would look at, well, um, the means by which you invent are likewise predicated upon a kind of Bayesian filter about producing what will happen, what's the most likely result that will happen next, and then
There's more. There's
attempting.
more to it than that, though. There is more to it than
Well,
that.
I think in the course of writing a poem, one of the features that makes poetry interesting and compelling, right, is that the next word, by its very nature, is statistically improbable. Right? Like
Mhm.
you want the next word in the sequence of words, right, to partake of a statistical improbability, right, that we're getting interesting combinations of words, right?
Yeah, and you want
That
that in all
yeah.
poetry. You want that in all art. You in all
Yeah,
creative pursuits. You want something
and the thing is
unusual.
that you look and say, okay, well, then we've cultivated machines so that they're capable of recognizing, through a kind of Bayesian filter, right, predicting the probability of something most likely occurring, and as a consequence, filling in the gap with that thing. The human mind does that already, right? I mean, you're constantly anticipating what the next sensory input will be, and it's anticipated, right? It's why we flunk optical illusion tests, right? It's why
Mhm.
you can make mistakes about what you see in the environment, right? You can be duped because there's an unanticipated uh, part to the filter. And one of my favorite theories of consciousness, like what constitutes consciousness, is in fact that moment when the brain wakes up to realize that it's confronted with a surprise. Oops, right? The prediction's off, right? Now I have to self-correct and reevaluate, right? And it's like being prodded awake, right? Otherwise, you're in a state of autopilot. I think machines are probably, gravitating right toward a singularity like that. Like there's a particular way in which Bayesian filters evolve to this point where they begin to appreciate the surprise because it makes you more attentive or conscious, really, like more self-aware. A poem defamiliarizes your experience of language, right? It breaks the uh, anticipated rules of syntax and grammar and diction and enlivens our experience of the language. Again, reinvents it for us. I mean, at least the best poetry does. And I don't foresee machines being capable of doing that. Like I look at this. I look and say you're assessing, whether or not this machine can do something that it is in a state of learning, right? It's in a state of emergence about it.
Yeah,
We
but
we
I would
we
no.
we were we I mean I remember the arguments being made by mathematicians merely a year or two ago, in which they were suggesting that no machine would be capable of understanding mathematical principles such that it could do calculations. Because again, it was operating under these anticipatory predictive models, right? What's the next thing that will likely occur? And as a consequence, it's not doing calculations. I can't look at 2 + 2 and it give you the answer four and know how and why it's doing that. But that's changing, isn't it? Right? Like now mathematicians have to, admit that the machines are probably at a state of learning, of reasoning that is no longer simply rote, right? That they are actually, acquiring, I suppose, aptitude, right? I don't think it's wise to imagine, right, that the machines have capacities that are special. Like they're not special. Like we're the ones who are really special. The machines aren't. I just don't foresee that there's anything that I can imagine them not doing. It's like
Well, okay, well, maybe.
it would seem to be really hard to think that I could probably every task, right?
Well,
Yeah.
look, I'm not gonna rule anything out, but I'm saying
Yeah.
if they can think like that, there's a big leap from just thinking algorithmically or
Mhm.
computationally. So going back to what I said about when I
Yeah.
write a palindrome, there is an intellectual process, but it's guided by feeling still, despite how intricate it is. A better example would be if I pick up a guitar and I play a solo. Of
Yeah.
course, you could just reduce that to a load of decision trees.
Yeah.
What note do I go to next? But that's not what I'm doing. I'm feeling my
Yeah,
way,
I would
and I don't
suggest that the
know.
computation, the level at which the computation is occurring, right, is mostly, unexamined, right? Like and
Mm.
probably not examinable, like
But you see what I mean? There's a big
because
leap, isn't there?
it's occurring at a much lower phase, like a lower, level of awareness, right? Like you don't want to be, I think, belaboring, what the next note will be while you're trying to play, right?
Mm.
Most of that kind of computation has to occur quickly and intuitively, right? And I,
Well,
I
if
think
it's
if you start
computation,
asking machines about their high level, thoughtfulness about how they came to a conclusion, like how did you solve this problem, we may end up getting answers like the vibe was good. This just feels right. Like, I mean, they may not be able to articulate very well why they were able to invent the tornado machine for us. Like,
yeah.
how did you invent anti-gravity? I don't know. It just it just worked, right?
But so do you think it is all human behavior can just be reduced to computation?
I'm not so sure, but I'm not so sure. But like that would be perhaps too large a claim for for my own skeptical scientific mind to make. But I do think we're prone right now to underestimate the degree to which we might ourselves be not much different than a large language model, right? Like,
Yeah.
capable of predicting what the next token will be.
Well, I know
Like,
that we disagree on whether or not AI is conscious or could be
yeah,
conscious.
but we keep moving the goalposts around consciousness because we don't actually have a definition of this phenomenon. There is no scientific observational way of identifying, what consciousness
Yeah.
is,
Well,
right?
that's my point. That then
Yeah, and because,
how
well,
can
here's the thing, it's
we
because you can't, because you don't know what it is. I think it's probably asking too much to then subsequently dismiss things as not having those features or those traits, right? Spontaneously deciding that it doesn't have it because I'm going, but you don't know how to recognize it, like when it exists. We don't have a means by which we can assess what consciousness actually is. And because we don't have that definition at hand, I think it's strange to then subsequently say that something doesn't have it, right? Because like you're speaking with confidence about this. I'm saying I think I would indulge in a bit of skepticism. I would just say because we don't know what consciousness is, it's hard then to imagine attributing consciousness to these machines or dismissing that they have consciousness. I think the jury's out. You have to be agnostic about this. Um, for now, like I would say, be agnostic because it's you know
Oh yeah, yeah. I think
yeah, right.
we're both agnostic about it, but
Mhm.
uh we're each leaning a different way on this.
Well, when I had a conversation with Samuel Andreev about uh, you know the shortcomings of machines, like something they couldn't do, right? He was remarking that they don't have embodied intelligence right now. Um, it might be a good thing that they don't, right, for now, but they will. I mean, like, it won't take long, right, for you to put this inside the skull of a robot, right? And it'll be networked. I mean, to me, that'll be the astonishing thing, right? Is that every person that you encounter that's a robot will in fact be, locked in, right, to some sort of grandiose cyborg networked intelligence, right? That will be very strange, right? Because we don't have a model of individuality at scale that's like that, right? I mean, this kind of colonial intelligence is not, where do you see that? Maybe in an anthill. I don't know. Like where would you find this kind of, intelligence at scale, that is quasi-sentient? It's, probably in the offing, like, it will walk out of a factory at Tesla, right, in a few years, right?
Yeah. Anyway, we should get back to poetry. Uh,
Sure.
so whether or not AI is conscious and whether or not it can start to think as intuitively as humans do is going to be used by poets.
Sure.
I mean, it's already being used by poets. What do you see the future being on that front?
The geniuses will have no problem figuring out how to use these technologies in a manner which adds value culturally. There will be a lot of people who might uh, lazily use the technology,
There'll be a lot of
for
a
mundane
lot of
purposes,
hacks writing bad
right?
poetry instead.
Well, yeah, I mean, for now, but we become quite. I think we'll become quickly dissatisfied. Um, you know, mobilizing the technology in that manner. It's not going to be a very satisfying experience to do it that way. I'm more interested in what Sasha's up to and other people are up to. because they really are adding value to the usage of these machines. And there will be enough refuseniks. There will be a lot of people who, among poets, who will be quite recidivist about this, that will look upon the new technologies with disdain and regard it as completely inhuman and a threat, basically, to their own mediocrity. In my experience, like just looking around, the geniuses don't care about the new technologies ever. They just look at that. I would say, great, new thing that grants me more superpowers, right? Well, I will figure this out. It was a fantastic thing that, potential opportunity for some novelty or an innovation, right? Something, or it won't be perceived as a threat anyway. Say, look, I've got my thing, right? I'm really, really quite happy with it, Don't regard this as a threat, regard it as some other alternative, right? I'll always be the genius, right here. The geniuses don't seem to me to be very concerned. The people who are mediocrities, I think, have good reason to be concerned, right? Like, they are going to be displaced and upstaged, right? And I don't think that there's many poets who like the fact that these technologies render the act of writing poetry far more demotic. Like it becomes an entry point for more people to acquire the aptitudes of the poet. And there's a lot of poets, I think, who don't want that. They would like every poem to exist first with their benediction and arbitrage, right? Their benediction and arbitration, right? They expect the poem to exist with their permission. And AI writes poetry without your permission, right? Does all kinds of things without your permission, right?
Mhm.
And that I think disturbs a lot of people who are at heart, I don't think, artists. Like, I would say an artist would look upon this in the same way that a writer might have looked upon the printing press. There was a lot of people, of course, in the era of the printing press who were concerned about the fact it would displace illuminated manuscripts, or suddenly render less esoteric the act of writing, right, and make it more demotic. And our experience of religious order, right? Like, there's no longer this hieratic relationship to God. I can just read the Bible for myself, right? I've got access, right, to scripts of political agendas and manifestos, and I've got my own manuals now for figuring out how to do something for myself, right? I can learn how to build inventions, or farm, or do something that's all on my own without reference to a hieratic personality who mediates that experience for me. And I think that's one of the reasons there's a great deal of anxiety about the advent of AI among artists, is that they look at the immense disruption that this will cause, because it will increase the number of participants.
Yeah, I mean, in ancient times, there are people who were against writing
Yes.
in general.
Well, the primary concern about the invention of writing was that it would diminish those capacities of human memory, right? That you'd have to cultivate an immense intellectual capacity to remember, say, a long poem like the Odyssey, right? Right? To be able to stand up in front of the campfire and proceed to recite, 10,000 lines of poetry. From memory was an extraordinary athletic feat, right? And to be able to do that recurrently, writing would diminish perhaps that capacity, and as it has, right? I mean, I can't remember even what my own phone number is without looking at my phone, right? You've delegated part of your mind, right, to a prosthesis, and I think there's perhaps some legitimate concern that this will make us stupid, perhaps, diminish our capacity to be smart, or it might just actually free us up to be more intelligent. Like, it could give us new, aptitudes, right? I think what ends up happening now is that the ability to demonstrate that you have a capacious memory becomes a recreational activity, right? It's no longer, right, something that you have to do for survival, right? Memorizing, Fahrenheit 451 verbatim so that I can recite it aloud, right, would become a recreational activity, become an aesthetic exercise, right, to become somebody who could, memorize an entire book and read it aloud. And perhaps, I would gain some fame if I did that, right?
Yeah. Before we stop, we've been going nearly an hour. I wanted to talk about your experiences in the visual arts, because you've had plenty of exhibits at galleries.
Sure.
and
Yeah.
a quick history of your experiences with galleries from when you first entered that world and
Mhm.
what surprised you about it, all the way through to, well, let's go up to COVID.
Right. Uh, well, I entered the artistic world early in my career, understanding that I didn't want to just be a poet who wrote. I would like poetry to kind of inhabit as many diverse varieties of media as possible. And again, this is a side effect of my own interest in conceptualism, trying to figure out what would constitute the conceivable limits of writing. And this entailed a lot of engagement with other media, other art forms, trying to figure out how to exploit them for poetic purposes. I built a book entirely out of Rubik's cubes, for example. I also built an entire book using nothing more than Lego tiles. And these objects were exhibited at an art gallery in New York. And that was my first experience of the art world. That was a very prestigious gallery to which I was invited to offer work. And I sold one of those objects for, at the time, 10,000 US dollars. That was a lot of money at that moment. And I sold it to a world class artist. Uh, Moreover, I went and attended the vernissage, and I got to meet a lot of celebrities. I actually got to shake hands with Robert De Niro, right? I got to meet, some exciting personalities, and I concluded pretty quickly that the art world was far more glamorous than the world of poetry, right? Why the hell am I a poet? I should just simply switch gears immediately to the art
You should
world.
have figured that out earlier.
Should have immediately become a full-time artist. And had I been smarter, perhaps I would have. But I really did make this, kind of, blood vow to be a great poet, to be an important poet of the 21st century. Uh, and I never gave it up. I continued to make things that could be exhibited in galleries, and I showed that work all around the world. I think the number of exhibits that I've had at art galleries now numbers in the vicinity of 80 or 90 over the course of my career. They've always provided a small supplementary income. There's occasions when, for a while, people take an interest and will buy the work, and it's great. It's an immense pleasure because in one single sale I could make the same income as selling 1,000 books of poetry, right? Right. The disparity in labor and cost, right, and price, is immensely different. But those sales are infrequent. It really is feast or famine for me at least in the art world. And I haven't figured out, based on my own poetic experience, how to make a real career out of it. I've come close on occasion to making a living out of it. Up to COVID, I had an opportunity to spend a year or two trying to become a full-time artist and discovered the milieu of NFTs and a group of poets who were founding their own avant-garde literary movement in response to the affordances of Web 3.0, the affordances of the blockchain, cryptocurrency, and NFTs. So just in the same way that my gang, responded to the affordances of, Web 1.0 and 2.0, these poets have, attempted to reinvent themselves in response to the affordances of this new version of the internet. And I managed to ingratiate myself with them and became a mascot in their group and get to at least relive in part some of my youthful innovation by selling artworks as NFTs or trying to exploit the blockchain for poetic purposes, all of which is very interesting and exciting. But for whatever reason, I've never been able to crack the milieu of celebrity, like figuring out how to sell a work for $1 million, or sell a work even for $100,000. Mostly, I'm lucky if I sell something for $1,000. But those experiences are very satisfying and probably more gratifying than even writing a poem, can be. The charge is different, I suppose, right? Because they're, being appreciated for a skill that I haven't fully mastered or for, an experiment that I tried out of curiosity. Um, Oh, in a high degree of uncertainty about its merits. And so the validation that you might get from somebody purchasing it is very appealing. I'm late in my career now. I turned 60 this year, and I don't know yet how to exploit whatever small degree of celebrity I have, such that I get to make $1 million. I haven't figured that out. I would like to imagine it would be first through the art world, maybe, that there would be some opportunity like that, but that hasn't really materialized. It's not. It's just as hard, right? Trying to be a poet in that milieu as it is to be a poet in the literary world. For me, it seems to be about the same.
Do you think that the future of visual art is in that area? Not necessarily NFTs, but
the future of any discipline has multiple pathways into the future. There's right now it's the greatest time to be a poet, greatest time to be an artist, and because there are so many opportunities, sociologically, technologically, at your disposal that make it easier to imagine being inventive and innovative and making important contributions. And yet, at the same time, you couldn't ask for the most hidebound, philistinic, parochial, puritanical people in the arts, like who are trying to prevent you from actually doing all of that exploration, right? For the most, egregious forms of political expediency, like just pretending, right, that it's unvirtuous to do any of this.
It's always been that way, though, hasn't it? Hasn't it always been this way?
Well, I remember other times when it was much more fun to be a poet than it is now, when it was much more fun to be an artist than it is now. And again, I've joked that it is more fun to be a poet in an even-numbered decade than it is to be a poet in an odd-numbered decade. In an odd-numbered decade, chances are you end up in a gulag. Right? Chances are you end up on the wrong side of a McCarthyite, inquisition, right? Like, you find yourself at the disposal of tyrannical attitudes from other artists. Like that's what's so dismaying, right? About perhaps the current moment is that there is an immense hidebound, philistinic or parochial character to many artists who are not interested in, the advancement of talent or exploration, and are primarily concerned with virtue. Right? They're just very, very concerned with making sure that everybody thinks the right thoughts. When I would have liked to have thought that the job of the poet is to think the wrong thoughts, right? Like to kind of do the wrong thing, right? And do it better than everybody else, right? Like to try and, figure out how to increase the number of permissions that are available to the writer, to the artist.
Something AI can't do.
Not well, not this week.
Yeah, one thing I want
Stay
to
tuned.
I want to ask you this. This
Mhm.
popped into my head about art galleries. During COVID, I attended a couple of online art galleries,
Yes, right.
and I think everyone thought this was going to be a big thing. But
Mm.
another thing that happened with COVID is that straight after COVID, people realized that they didn't want to be stuck online anymore.
Yeah.
They wanted to see real people and have that
Yeah,
human
yeah,
connection.
absolutely. And
So
thank God they did.
yeah. So do you think that that will be a big thing in the future, the online interactive art gallery spaces, or do you think that was a
I
fad?
think let's put it this way: these are opportunities. These are paths that might not have been sufficiently pursued. And some experimental artist in the future, some avant-garde personality in the future, is going to rediscover it and say, "Look, that path has only gone so far down uh, into the woods. Wouldn't it be great to actually persist in exploring this possibility with greater thoroughness?" I can foresee that happening, right? It typically happens. How people reinvent the past is by discovering something that uh, has probably been underutilized, right? A potential revolutionary, affordance that, kind of got picked up and then dropped, right? For something else. So I wouldn't discount that, some of the kinds of innovations that are, experiments that people did while constrained by the pandemic won't be revisited, more enthusiastically by other people in the future. I think that those are all ripe avenues for rediscovery.
Okay, so we need to stop because I've finished my beer and I need one. So last question. What advice do you have to someone, a young person now, looking to become a poet? What's the best piece of advice you could give them?
Um, there will be some facet of your aptitudes that will be interpreted as a weakness, as a kind of failure, something that's a shortcoming. And yet you'll nevertheless be invested in it. You'll be committed to it passionately to one degree or another. You will not foresee that you can fix that particular problem. But it'll be presented to you as though it were something akin to a disability, right? Something that constitutes a shortcoming in your capacity to be who you are as a poet. And I think that typically you have to figure out how to transform what would otherwise be dismissed as a weakness, turn it into a strength, transform that thing that you're passionately invested in doing, despite, the critical dismissal of others, and figure out how to make it pertinent. Because it's usually those aspects of your character that are probably uniquely your own. So that's one of the things I've kind of learned right away is that if you're standing in an academic setting as an art student, for example, learning to paint at the easel, you have to learn to load the brush properly so that it doesn't drip when you apply the paint to the canvas, right? And it's of course a failure, right, to have a drip on the canvas when you're trying to paint. Unless, of course, you lie the canvas flat and are Jackson Pollock, right? Right. There's somebody who's transformed what would otherwise be a feature, like a particular stylistic trope or idiosyncrasy, that normally would be dismissed as a failure. He's turned it into a completely different aesthetic agenda that is emulatable and contributes something of value to our understanding about how to do what we do. So everybody probably has that capacity, and because you're the only person doing it, right? You're the only person being who you are. You have to make that perspective, I think, as valuable as possible because it's the only thing that couldn't be reinvented if we lost access to all knowledge. I think every single mathematical fact, every single scientific fact will be rediscovered if civilization were to be destroyed, but not Mozart's symphonies, right? Only Mozart could have found them, right? They're not going to be discovered note for note. They're not going to be recreated note for note, right? In the way that the theory of evolution will be rediscovered, right? To me that's what it makes the contribution important is that you have to figure out how to transform this thing that would otherwise be dismissed in you and turn it into a strength.
Good advice. I've told you I'm learning to sing at the moment.
Yeah.
And this is the thing a lot of singers have to do, they're forced to do, is
Yeah.
not try to hide the flaws in their voice, but
That's right.
find the right way to use them. So
Yeah.
it's good general advice.
Yeah. I think that's good advice. Figure out how to use the flaws to your advantage. Yeah.
Thank you, Christian. This is always fun.
Yeah. Thank you, Anthony, for allowing me to come back on to your conversations. I appreciate being able to provide support for your enterprise. And I hope your listeners have enjoyed the conversation. Thanks a lot for indulging me.